Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Mark DeMaz. I'm joined by my colleagues Harry Lee and Allison Clinton here in Little Rock at Mosaics Global Network headquarters. And today, my very special guest is Dave Livermore, founder of the Cultural Intelligence Center in Grand Rapids, Michigan, with offices as well in Chicago. And as you're going to learn, a branch now even in Little Rock, Arkansas. Today, we're talking about cultural intelligence, commonly referred to as CQ. What is cultural intelligence? Where did the concept come from? How is it developed? Why is it important for you as a pastor, ministry leader to understand that, not only for yourself, but your organization to develop cultural intelligence? We're going to talk about the why, the how, and the what of CQ today with our expert, Dave Livermore, author again of the book, Leading with Cultural Intelligence, founder of the Cultural Intelligence Center in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So Dave, let me first welcome you to the show and say thank you so much for making time to be with us today.
Thank you, Mark. It's a privilege.
You bet. Well, Dave, hey, for those people who may not be familiar with you, your history, your background, let's just start with a little bit of personal information if we could. Talk to us about who you are and from where you've come.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And as you noted, Mark, it's my privilege to lead the Cultural Intelligence Center. We'll talk lots more about that in the next hour. But I've been doing that for about 10 years, though I've been engaged in the work of cultural intelligence for more than 20. My wife and I have been married 27 years. We have two adult daughters, 20 and 22. And as you said, we currently live in Michigan. We've been here about 15 years now, but we've lived a variety of places across the country and around the world. We spent several years living in Singapore and working across the Southeast Asian region. So yeah, that in a snapshot is who I am and a little bit of the context from which I get to do this work.
Yeah, so you were actually a missionary before, and I know that you taught as well at Calvin College. Talk to us about your Christian roots, your Christ-centered understanding, and your missionary journeys that I'm sure played a big part in your own development of cultural intelligence for yourself, for your family, and ultimately for the company that you now lead.
Yeah, so while the last 10 years, my work at the Cultural Intelligence Center means working with a real wide array of organizations that we'll talk a little bit more about, but really my professional roots are entirely in the ministry realm. So I started out in local church ministry and was wrestling with doing youth ministry in a very multicultural, socioeconomically diverse context. And then, yeah, you're right. I was leading a nonprofit organization, a ministry based out of Chicago, but then expanding our work internationally, which is what took me overseas. So really, for the first 20 of my 30 years of professional career, I was solely focused on ministry. And while I now have the opportunity of working in a variety of spaces, there's still nowhere that I feel more at home than when I'm with a group of fellow pastors, missionaries, people engaged in the cause that's most important to me, the cause of Christ.
Yeah, well, it's super important for us to hear that, especially for ministry leaders that are on this call today. We're joined by Dave Martin, Dwayne Moyer, good to have you, Israel, and Larry Taylor, so glad to have you here on the webinar with Zoom. I know a number of people are watching Facebook. Our guest today, Dave Livermore, founder of the Cultural Intelligence Center in Chicago and Grand Rapids. You've heard of CQ. He's the author of the book, Leading with Cultural Intelligence. My colleague Harry Lee is manning the Zoom webinar. You're going to hear more about Harry and his work with CQ because he's an integral part of what CQ is doing now in partnership with Mosaics. And of course, as always, the one and only Allison Clinton, who makes all things possible where Mosaics is concerned. So Dave, you've talked about your Christian background, your missionary context, your Christ-centered faith, and on all that. But I know that you've been involved, like you said, over the past 10 years in even more the secular arena, working with businesses and particularly international businesses and the government, Department of Defense. We're going to talk about some of the companies that you have worked with through the Cultural Intelligence Center. But before we do that, I'm guessing, and this is part question, part guess, but where did you first become aware of the need for cultural intelligence? Where did that first register? You know, I was a missionary back for 2 years in Germany, working with American military dependents at Ramstein Air Force Base, 1989, 1991. And yeah, we lived on the German economy, but even then I wasn't really thinking about becoming culturally intelligent. I was just doing my thing in a different country. But for you, it was something more than that. And somewhere along the way, I'm sure some, things began to click in your mind that I just can't be me. I have to think about who I'm with, where I'm at, and develop cultural intelligence. So with that in mind, how did you first become aware of that concept, both personally and then even in academics?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Mark. So, in one way, while I certainly didn't have language for it for years, I feel like this has been a source of curiosity for me from as far back as I can remember. My parents are Canadian. I was brought up in a very progressive New York neighborhood in very progressive schools, but growing up in a hyper fundamentalist kind of Christian environment, et cetera. And so even some of those relatively minor, but to me as a kid, significant differences of Canadian customs, living in New York, being brought up in this Christian home. But also I had an early on call to missions. And so was wrestling with what does it mean to be a missionary and uproot from all of this and live somewhere around the world. Fast forward to, as I mentioned a moment ago, then I'm suddenly in my first local youth ministry. And like so many of our churches in the late 80s, early 90s, found myself in a church that was suddenly surrounded by a neighborhood that looked nothing like the people that were driving in there to go to church anymore. And I'm like, well, what does this look like? All my kids are white and all the people living in the neighborhood aren't. And then I go into my next ministry endeavor, which was really to lead Sun Life, a youth ministry organization. And hey, take what we're doing global. And I get overseas and kind of behind closed doors, I talk to youth ministry and leaders who are like, okay, you know what you guys are teaching isn't necessarily biblical. It's this very Western notion of ministry that you've like rooted in other kind of biblical ideas. So all that kind of like inspired me to pursue this as part of my own academic research. And so that's when I more formally started to study it. And really, it was my dissertation research that eventually led me to the more specific notion of cultural intelligence, because I was looking at what happens when North American pastors go overseas for 10 days to 2 weeks and teach local pastors, or as we called them then, nationals, and was asking like, how effective is that? Can you take megachurch America and suddenly go into Liberia and think that those principles are going to translate? And so that's what really then gave me this idea of, okay, there are some core principles that are important to us as Christians, but then how do we not colonize our cultural wineskins, if you will, upon other people? Last thing I'll say with that, then the longer I began to talk about this internationally, people back in the US would say to me, well, you know, the same thing is happening here. This isn't just an international missions phenomenon. You've got well-intended suburban churches blowing into under-resourced communities thinking they're going to save them with their new endeavors in that. So long answer to your question, but you know, both kind of personally and ministry-wise, those were all what kind of led me to say, there's got to be a way that we could do this better.
Yeah, you saw Allison and me shaking our heads. Yeah, we've heard that obviously 20 years here, Harry as well. The neighborhood, the world has come to our doorstep. Pastors talk about this, and it used to be that maybe we have to engage cross-culturally overseas, but of course today, for pastors and ministry leaders, it's right outside our front doors. And churches particularly, as well as other faith-based organizations, must develop cultural intelligence if they hope to advance a credible and relevant gospel in an increasingly diverse and cynical society. By the way, I'm joined today, we are joined, I should say, by Dave Livermore, founder of the Cultural Intelligence Center. We got this running on Zoom as a webinar, as well as on Facebook Live. Your comments, your thoughts, your questions are certainly welcome about the entire topic of CQ for Dave. Just leave them in the chat if you would, here on the Zoom webinar, or comment on Facebook. Harry's manning Zoom, Allison's manning Facebook. I want to welcome my good friend Anita Eastlack from the Wesleyan denomination. Does such a wonderful job at the national office. Anita, good to have you. Craig Miller's with us as well. Joe Smart Trent is also with us in the Wesleyan denomination. Vincent Silman and Woodson Walker. Kent Mariashi, he's always with us. Good to have you, brother. Hey, your questions, your ideas, we're welcome for Dave here in a little bit. So as we continue to dive deep, we talked a little bit about your personality, your background, who you are, how the idea of cultural intelligence, which we'll refer throughout the call to as CQ, developed for you. But let's talk now, if you would, talk to us about cultural intelligence, CQ. Exactly what is it, and why is it important for us to develop it today?
Yeah, Mark, let me segue into that by saying one more thing to your previous question. How did I stumble on it? And then that translates into what it is. So it won't surprise any of us joining today's session to know that those of us as academics tend to be really good at pointing out problems and not always offering solutions. And so my dissertation research, as you might imagine, did not shed a whole lot of great light on what was happening in the ministry community internationally. But I didn't want to be the academic that just came out swinging. We're doing it all wrong. Stop doing your mission trips. Quit doing ministry into multicultural neighborhoods, et cetera. How do we actually offer some kind of solution? And that's when serendipitously God connected me with Soon Ang, my colleague in Singapore, who was doing some of the earliest research on this notion of cultural intelligence. So yeah, to your question, what is it? So cultural intelligence is the skill, the capability to work effectively with people from different cultural backgrounds. And so we're really interested in going beyond just awareness, though I certainly think awareness is a critical first step to, yeah, okay, we get it. We're different. We have a very diverse community, church, neighborhood, world, et cetera. But now what? Now that we have a more diverse group, how do we actually work more effectively with each other? So cultural intelligence is all about adaptability. Can you adapt to everything from as superficial, though seemingly significant worship styles, to much more significant of how do we read the text? How do we think about our faith? How do we talk about our faith? What's the role of men and women and parents and all that? So it's an overall framework for, does a leader in particular have the ability to work effectively with all the different cultures that exist in their congregation, in their community, et cetera?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I want this whole call to be about you, but in my own journey from 1997 into planning Mosaic in 2001 here in the urban center of Little Rock, Arkansas, and then over the next few years, I didn't even know. First of all, I'm not an academic. Yes, I have terminal degrees, but I would never consider myself an academic. I do teach at seminaries and all that, but I'm just a blue collar pastor on the streets, hustling, street hustle, working hard. But it's so interesting that in those first few years, very quickly, I realized, not just in terms of ethnic culture, but then also the economic and class cultural distinctions and differences. And so in the early days of our church, those first few years, we were gaining cross-cultural intelligence and competence by forming cross-cultural relationships with people. And so much so that in 2007, when my first book came out, Building a Healthy Multi-Ethnic Church, and we crafted 7 core commitments for building a healthy multi-ethnic church. Ironically, number 4 was develop cross-cultural relationships, and number 5 was pursue cross-cultural competence. That's what I called it. I had no idea there was literature. There was an entire industry, if you will, developing, but we were being shown by the Holy Spirit, I suppose, things that others like you that were more studious and thoughtful about it were coming to terms with an understanding. And of course, your book, Leading with Cultural Intelligence, and other writings you've done brought that to the forefront. But I'm just saying it's very interesting that this is what it takes to be competent and relevant in an increasingly diverse society. We as pastors and ministry leaders and our churches have to develop cultural intelligence, right?
Yeah, and I think, Mark, to that point, at the risk of patronizing you, we have to have both. If it's purely theoretical, empirical kind of, it starts to feel very cold. And oh, here's this skill that you developed. It's got to be done up close with people. But to your point, what I've found with you as a grateful exception, what I've found too often happens is people are motivated maybe by shame or whatever for why they're not being very effective dealing with diverse communities, or how they're all a bunch of racist bigots, but then we don't give them any tools to handle it. And so I was watching this a lot when I was still in full-time ministry, and people saying, okay, you've motivated us to actually care about the world, but now what am I supposed to do with it? I do want to build that cross-cultural relationship, but is having coffee with them enough? Like, how do we actually change the way we do ministry? So that's where I think the two work so well together. The raw blue collar hustler, as you call it yourself, lots of life experience and having effectively developed multicultural ministry all across the globe and in a very local context in Little Rock, together with the academic research to say, with this together, we can really follow in the line of what I believe God's heart to be, to have all of us worship, learn from one another.
Yeah, and to your point about kind of the intersection of relationships and and intelligence, it's a both and, right? It's not linear. It's almost circular. That, as we've learned, and I'm sure you'd validate, when we build healthy cross cultural relationships, both ethnically, economically, and culturally, we, in the process of developing transparency and trust with others, we, in some ways, by osmosis, we begin to pick up and gain a measure of cultural intelligence. But then, of course, there's also the serious side, or the and I don't want to say academic, but then there's a thoughtfulness that must go into that as well. And that's, again, where what you've developed in the CQ Center, and particularly the CQ assessment, is so helpful. And I want to turn your attention, our attention, to that right now. And I want to ask you about the book, the company, and more specifically about the CQ assessment. How did that come about? How did you develop it? Tell us all about this tool, this absolute great resource, research-based tool. Tell us about that, how it developed, what it is, and why it's important for us to understand that.
Yeah, so the short answer is it developed by a group of us saying that this whole field of cross-cultural work is really squishy and it's hard to kind of make it more measurable. And in particular, because my colleagues were working more in the corporate sector, there was a growing intolerance for anything that didn't have hard facts to it. And so we wanted to say, could you actually develop an empirical tool that would predict how well people would actually engage with people from different cultures? Similar to how emotional intelligence came on the scene and helped us to see, hey, guess what? Book smarts is not enough. You know, rarely do you have churches coming to a seminary saying, give me your 4.0s who are best at parsing Greek because I know they will be our best pastor. It doesn't mean it's unimportant, but tell me about their people skills. Tell me about their leadership capabilities. Same thing in the business arena has been saying, give us people who actually know how to manage people and in the midst of a global pandemic, know how to actually pivot and adapt to change. So all that to say is we were like, could we actually design an instrument that would do this? And so, you know, you and Harry have heard all this, you teach it alongside of us, but we started by looking at a number of the things that were already in the space, the diversity and intercultural competence. We found, of course, a lot of really useful things that informed our own thinking. But what we found was lacking was a tool that specifically measured skill. So there's things out there that will measure, are you even open to this conversation? Or are you still very ethnocentric in your worldview? There's things that measure, what's your preference for more direct communication or indirect? But there wasn't something that in an academically sound way measured, will this person be able to perform well in a multicultural context? So I am not the originator of the actual design of the instrument. I'm a qualitative researcher, as we say. It's my colleagues Soon Eng and Lin Van Dyne from Nanyang Technological University and Michigan State that designed the instrument. And we went through a 10-year process of developing items, talking to real life practitioners like those of you on this call of like, okay, you know, here's the academic way we'd say this, but you would never talk about this in real life. So how would you actually go about it? And then we kept validating the assessment. And then, you know, 8-10 years later, had a high level of validity to it where it could actually be used. So.
Well, I know from my own interaction with you, Harry, and I, Allison, that this assessment now has been taken by approximately 150,000 people in roughly 165 countries, I believe. And it's so helpful because it gives you kind of like a map in an airport. You are here, not only individually, but it can be used for your organization, for your staff teams, where you can collectively aggregate those scores and say, okay, you are here as a collective organization. And then, of course, from there, advance in terms of practical growth in various areas of that. Our guest today, Dave Livermore from the Cultural Intelligence Center. Angie Sprague's watching, Brad Aycock, so good to have you. Kenneth Gerald, Carlos Urosa, and Kevin Ha, just some of the folks on Facebook. Again, we want your questions and thoughts for Dave. You can chat them both on the webinar, on the Zoom webinar, in the chat box, or on Facebook Live. We want to get you involved interacting with Dave as we're talking about cultural intelligence. And by the way, later in this program, if you stay with us to the very end, we're going to be announcing a killer new partnership that Mosaics particularly is so honored and so excited to announce and to announce jointly with Dave today. But also, we're going to be offering you a discount on pricing with the CQ assessment, CQ Center. You don't want to miss that. We'll come up to that just towards the top of the hour as we finish this call today. So stay on for that announcement and for that discount coming up. Now, Dave, in the assessment, CQ assessment, talk to us for a moment exactly what gets assessed. You might pretend I'm the person that's saying, hey, Dave, okay, if I take your assessment, what is actually going to be measured?
Yeah. So first of all, I think an important thing to clarify, and you said it well already, Mark, is that this gives you a measurement of where you are, where your organization is today. It's not oh, you're doomed. You can never be an effective multicultural or culturally intelligent pastor. So it's something that's a snapshot in time, but it can develop, it can change. The other thing, and then big picture, what it measures is where are you in the likelihood that you'll be effective leading a multicultural team, church, ministry, etc. More specifically, there's 4 capabilities that we measure in the assessment, and there's several nuanced things within that. But just briefly, the 4 capabilities are, first of all, we get at what's one's level of motivation, that we call it CQ drive. What's their level of interest and motivation to even be engaged in multicultural ministry? How do they see it rooted in the story of who God has called us to be and what our vision is? The second piece, the piece that most often gets emphasized in cross-cultural competency things, is knowledge. To what degree do I have an understanding that I would view the world or view the scriptures or view God the Father very differently if I had grown up in a different cultural environment, etc. The third piece is what we call CQ strategy, and that's okay, great. I have this drive and desire to do it, and I have some basic understanding of how my Latinx community members might view this as compared to how my Asian American community members might. But now, what's my strategy for ministry going to be? Are we just going to have, all different kinds of ministries for different people, or is there one holistic ministry we do? And then finally, the final piece that we measure is what we call CQ action, and that's to what degree can I be true to myself, my convictions, the identity of who I am, but also adapt enough to be effective in what you're doing. So when one takes the assessment, they don't just get you're culturally intelligent or not. Rather, it's in which areas are you strong and where are the areas where you could develop most from some improvement.
Yeah, so summarizing that, there are 4 areas that are measured: your drive, your knowledge, strategies, and actions. And I know, Dave, real quick, just circling back for those that may be just joining us, what's the difference between strategy and action? Drive, of course, is my internal desire, my drive to understand others different than myself, their cultural context, etc. My knowledge is just what that is: facts, figures, if you will. What do I understand, I suppose, at an academic or technical level about other people groups, other cultures? But sometimes strategy and action could be confused. What specifically is the nuance between that third and fourth measurement that CQ assessment does?
Yeah, so strategy is very specifically the degree to which I sit down and anticipate what's going to be the most effective way to do this. And then action is, can you actually do it? So to give a concrete example, let's say I've been tasked with giving a presentation to a largely African American congregation. My strategy is up front, to what degree should I deliver this in light of what I anticipate the norms to be and how they're going to perceive me as a middle-aged white guy coming in with all the issues that go with that? So how am I anticipating that up front without stereotyping them? Then the action is, okay, it's nice that I had this plan, but now that I'm actually giving that message, that presentation, whatever, am I adapting enough that's being effective without somehow trying to be something I'm not and think that I'm going to somehow preach as an African American, something I should never try and do, but I should probably try and adapt some of what's there. So you're absolutely right. They're 2 sides of the same coin, but one is, if we want to think about it at a more macro level, I just talked about an isolated presentation, but at a more macro level, how am I strategizing how to have a multicultural ministry? One of the things that Mosaics has been doing with organizations for years. And then action, okay, now's the actual implementation. And that's where CQ really comes to bear, because you can have a really nice strategy put together of how you're going to really pull off this multicultural ministry thing, but then engage in microaggressions with the first conversation you've had with someone totally blind to the fact that there's this big power difference that's happening here that didn't get reflected in the piece of paper that was written down.
Yeah,
There,
that's so good to clarify that. And Harry, I know Harry was assessed prior to our formal relationship, which we're going to announce, by the way, here in a little bit, a brand new exclusive partnership between CQ Center and Mosaics Global Network, also offering a discount later on in the program. Stay tuned for that. But Harry was assessed, or certified, I should say, in CQ prior to this partnership. And I know, Harry, you've had a chance to kind of dig deep with some faith-based organizations, holding workshops, assessing people. What's been your experience with CQ? And as you think about that, how is that helpful? If you were a pastor, or someone's listening, they're a pastor or ministry leader, what's been your experience, and why would you encourage them to not only be assessed, but bring that to their organization?
yeah, well, it's just like what you said, Mark. It's the journey of understanding our own cultural bubbles that we live in. You know, we all have these perspectives that are shaped by our politics, our upbringing, our socioeconomics, all the different cultural factors that influence us. And so for me, it was just like, I just wanted to continue to expand my worldview, because I feel like the end of the story from a theological perspective, of course, is Revelation 7, where we're all gathered around the throne, some from every tongue, tribe, people, language, all of those different people. And so I knew that in order for me really to chase that dream, that model, that vision for the end of the story, I had to understand a whole lot more about the way other kinds of people thought besides just me. And when I was doing my research on it, I couldn't find another better tool that just was so incredibly practical. I mean, that's what I really love about CQ. And maybe Dave, you could expound on that, because you have very definitive outcomes-based results and goals that come out of people that follow this CQ journey. And for me, I can tell you for a fact, it's really expanded my understanding of different people groups. They call them clusters in CQ. It's taught me a lot about myself in terms of how I have values that are instilled in me, having been the son of a first generation Chinese mom and dad who, you know, came here virtually not with no money and not speaking English much, and just how that shaped me in the way I think. But maybe Dave, you could just keep expounding on, because this is what I love about it, is it really results in a certain level of skill set that allows you to be more effective. What could you expect in terms of those outcomes that, if you're a pastor, that you would love to see for yourself and your teams?
Yeah, thanks, Harry. There's a number of them. We can look very specifically based upon the assessment results, the degree to which one, for example, is likely just to be able to adjust to being part of a more multicultural ministry. It's frustrating, right? It's challenging. Like those of us who take the time to join a call like this, I would guess our drive is very high. We love different cultures, but if you've ever been part of a multicultural team, it's hard work. You know, people misunderstand what's going on. You know, at a more specific level, we can map very specifically the accuracy of decision making, or the soundness of decision making that's made in light of a multicultural ministry. You know, is this likely to be on point with how people from a diversity of backgrounds are going to be there? We can do things like predict how well someone is likely to be able to build trust on a multicultural leadership team. So, you know, of course, I'm a person of faith first and foremost, so I would never say, oh, this is all just about, you can measure it in assessment and there it goes. Like there's, of course, the supernatural, transcendent aspect that's there, but I believe one of the things that God has given us is a tool like this that can help inform and guide making good use of what God's called us to do. The other thing that Harry's comment reminded me of that I failed to mention, Mark, in some of your earlier questions is a unique place that CQ finds itself in this broader conversation is we focus more on your ability to interact with any number of different cultures, as compared to what a lot of the attention has been throughout the years is more specifically on how to understand the Chinese, or how to understand the African American, or how to understand millennials. And of course, there's still value in some of that culturally specific input. But let's talk about someone like Harry for a second. Like, what culture should I study to figure out Harry? Like, he doesn't fit into any particular box, and do any of us. Like, sure, there are aspects of me being a white, straight, evangelical, middle-aged male that tell you something about me. me that I'm very aware of, but there's also aspects about me that can't be just compartmentalized to what's there. So CQ is far more about a more sophisticated measure of how do I read a situation, pick up on the cues of what is going on, and then think about what would be the appropriate response. So circling way back to your question, Harry, I think what this really allows us to do is it helps us to develop people in our ministries who can respond on the fly to something that isn't a neatly packaged, when an African-American 23-year-old male says this, then do this. No, we can't say that. Which 23 African-American male, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't factor in at all their ethnicity in that. So CQ at least gives you some kind of compass of what might be some ways I could strategize a way to convey what I want to in the name of Jesus to that individual.
Yeah, you know, speaking of that tool, Larry Taylor asks, is the CQ tool found in your book, Leading with Cultural Intelligence? And
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mark.
No, that's fine. Go ahead. I was going to answer, say, we're going to talk about how you can access that tool in just a little bit, even at a discounted price. But if it is a specific question, was that found, the tool in its book, or was just the beginnings of that tool in that book?
Yeah, great question. We did already have the tool out by the time the first edition of that book was there, but the assessment itself is not in the book. The assessment is something that's completed online, which also allows you to be receiving the benefit of all the data that comes from the 150,000 others who have done. So you get to see, how do I score compared to how 150,000 other global leaders in very diverse contexts score on these areas.
Yeah, and Larry, and for all others of you who are interested in the assessment itself, we're going to talk about how to access that, our new partnership that is Mosaics Global Network with the CQ Center to deliver faith-based training, CQ assessment and training workshops to you, to your staff, to your teams, even your church in just a little bit. And if you stay tuned, we're going to announce a big discount for you with that as well as we announce this new partnership. Dave, Dan Crane asks this question. Maybe you remember, he says, Dan Crane from Atlanta with One Race, one of your former students at Grand Rapids Theological Seminary. He's with us. He says, thanks so much for everything you taught me back then. Here's my question. What biblical text do you argue from when talking about developing cultural competency?
The whole thing. Next question.
Genesis,
come on, Dan.
Right?
I don't view it as two testaments, but one narrative. So no, excellent question. And I know the spirit from which Dan is coming. So if I'm forced to one, then I would go to a place like Harry did in terms of Revelation 7:9. But here's why I say the whole thing. For me, this whole idea of cultural intelligence is rooted in the wonder of who God is and the fact that God chose to communicate who he is in the image of himself through a person. So he didn't just give us some abstract notion. It was, okay, I'm going to give you a living version of God in the flesh, etc., through Adam. And then, as Dan knows, because he's heard me talk about this, following that throughout even the Old Testament, then you've got this priestly nation that's supposed to be a picture to the Gentile nations. And then through the person of Jesus, we get the living presence of God, the second Adam, giving us a perfect description of it. So I really do mean that. I think sometimes we sell ourselves short if we're just defending this based upon chapter and verse, the Great Commission, the Great Commandment, Revelation 7:9, or talking about Paul taking the gospel to all the Gentile nations. Those are certainly effective proof texts, etc. But I think really it fits best within the whole scope of this is the wonder of the Christian story, that our God became a person. And therefore, if we're going to get to know the good news up close, it has to be manifested in cultural forms and norms that actually make sense to us.
Yeah, if I could jump in on that question as well, and you're absolutely right, cover to cover, Genesis 1 to the end of Revelation, this is the story, the nature, the character of God revealing. He's for all people, not just some people. Faith, hope, and love for all, not just some, a constant theme for us at Mosaics Global Network. If you're a pastor of a church, specifically, this is where Mosaics often goes to, though, is to narrow into the New Testament, because in my experience through the years, I would find people, if I was speaking to pastors or I hear others speaking to pastors sometime about specifically developing their church as a healthy, multi-ethnic, economically diverse, and socially just organization. And I say, hey, we need to develop cultural intelligence and be a multi-ethnic church. You know, in Genesis, and all of a sudden, what you see is kind of that glazed donut look. And I know for a number of pastors through the years, it's not that the case can't be or shouldn't be made from the first part of the entire book, the Old Testament, as we say. But what I know is going on in their mind is that that's descriptive, or that is something for heaven, Revelation 7:9, but it doesn't apply to me today. And along with erroneous teaching concerning the homogeneous unit principle in 1972, that's been perpetuated now for more than 50 years, a principle that otherwise, according to Donald McGavran, was an evangelistic and discipleship principle, misapplied then to the local church, to planting, growth, and development, that seemingly justified people planting, growing, and developing churches specific to a homogeneous context, which you will not find in the New Testament. This is where we have zeroed in on 3 passages, Dan, specific to your question. Christ envisions the multi-ethnic church on the night before he dies, John 17. If they will be one, no guarantee that they will, but if my disciples will be one, the world will recognize that you sent me. The world will come to experientially understand that God, the Father's love, is for all people, not just some people. Secondly, it was modeled for us or described for us by Luke in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 11, the model church of the New Testament is Antioch. It's multi-ethnic, missional, multi-site, and mega. It's everything you want to be, led by a diverse leadership team, Acts 13:1. You can read about it there. So first, Christ envisions the multi-ethnic church. Luke describes the multi-ethnic church in action as a model for us at the church at Antioch. And then ultimately, Paul prescribes the multi-ethnic church for us. Wherever possible, he expects that local churches and salvation would be offered to all people. The local church would be for all people. And ultimately, as we've said, the kingdom of God is for all people. So when you think about it specific to the New Testament, and for we who are pastors of local churches, Christ envisioned it, John 17, Luke described it, Acts 11, and Paul prescribes it throughout his life and writings, particularly in the book of Ephesians and in Romans, Galatians, and others. Hey, Dave, I want to move on. Also, we've talked about the assessment. And by the way, Tremaine Mason's with us from Durham, North Carolina. Matt McGew, good to have you, my friend, this morning. Esther Martinez, Kimberly D, Chip Freed, they're going to be working with us in CQ. I know Chip is going to get certified soon. Rolo Caspiel is with us. Angel Jordan, of course, you know him already, Dave. We've talked about the CQ assessment. And before we go on to talk about our partnership, discounts, and how people can access this, use it for their own good and for the good of their staff, teams, and churches, let's talk about CQ Pro. So CQ assessment is, as Dave mentioned, and we'll talk more about this, an online assessment that you can take, much like Strength Finders or the DISC test or something, but you can take it online. You can get a load of information based on 150,000 people in 165 countries who've taken this. And that's typically called the CQ assessment. But what can be pulled out of that assessment as well is a score rooted that's called the cultural values profile, right? And it evaluates where you fall on a continuum of 9 cultural values. And Dave, I want you to talk about that. We talked again, just by way of recap, for those just joining us, CQ assessment gets at your internal motivation and drive to have cross-cultural intelligence, your knowledge base, your strategy, and ultimately how you act upon that strategy in encountering and working with diverse people. That's CQ assessment. But the cultural values profile also is part of that, pulls out where you fall on a continuum of 9 cultural values. Tell us about those 9 values and about this aspect, the cultural values profile that's baked into what is called CQ Pro.
Yeah, so as compared to CQ, where you would say, oh, where am I and how do I improve my capability because I want to get better at this, the cultural values is more like personality assessment or Strength Finders, where it's neither good nor bad. It's just descriptive information of how I prefer to engage and relate with people. So a couple examples, many of you will be very familiar with these ideas. You know, do I think more as an individualist or more as a collectivist? And, you know, we can certainly biblicize either one of those, but either one is neither good nor bad. It's, am I oriented when I go about my work in a more autonomous way, or I tend to work more collectively with people? You know, another one that would be very familiar to all of you as you think about leadership is, do I prefer a more top-down approach to leadership or a more flat egalitarian? And of course, you can think about, many of our underrepresented groups in the US would be cultures that tend toward more hierarchical forms of leadership, the importance of a reserved parking space, perhaps for an African-American pastor, or calling them reverend, et cetera, as compared to, some of our more younger church plants, et cetera, where, hey, just call me Dave, super casual, et cetera. So there's 10 of those cultural value dimensions in which one finds themselves. The thing that's interesting about this is, first of all, it gives language to something that people sometimes in our politically correct world don't know how to talk about. So like another one of those is direct versus indirect communication. And you'll have people sometimes encountering these very different values of direct, indirect, or top down versus flat, but feel like, oh, if I say this, am I going to sound racist or culturally insensitive? And so now I have language to say, it seems like our Latino brothers are really functioning in a way that's much more high power distance, whereas, those of the people who look more like me seem to be in a more low power distance. Is that some of what our conflict is here? So it's a way to measure invisible diversity that goes beyond just measuring the visible diversity that exists according to race, ethnicity, age, etc. So to come way back to the practical value of that, as Mark was saying, this can be even pulled out and used just as a standalone, often as a great starting point. And let's just have some conversation about, even if a lot of the people on our team look similar on the outside, how might we be wired differently? Or we might find out that Dave and Harry have much more similar cultural values than either one of us might have with people who look more like either one of us on the outside. And then finally, you can also get a team composite of this. I actually use this with our own staff at the Cultural Intelligence Center, where everybody's name on our staff is listed across these 10 dimensions. And so before we roll out some new initiative, I think about, okay, wait a second, how are these individuals going to respond to this as compared to these because of how they're wired? So, yeah.
Yeah, that's so good. I know, Harry, you've worked with that a lot as well. And I think, unless I just missed it, also part of that assessment on the continuum, Harry, right, is where it also shows you how different cultures across the world might score on, for instance, individualism versus collectivism in terms of thought, right? Africa might score different than Western Europe or Asia, right? Harry, talk to us about that from your perspective, how you use that and how you see that. I know you had another question as well for Dave.
Yeah, well, it's really a snapshot of the way the world thinks. I mean, they've divided the entire world into all these global clusters, and then they've essentially ran statistical analysis on all these cultural personalities, so to speak. So it's really, just think about personality types. It's almost like mass personality types for whole cultures, but it will be extremely revealing. I mean, I've used it before. For example, a university in Central Florida, there was 300,000 Puerto Ricans that had moved to the area. They were wanting to know, how can we best effectively recruit and make ourselves the premier educational choice for this group that just relocated to Central Florida. And so we went down there, we mapped the entire faculty on the cultural values chart, and we showed where they stood collectively in relationship to Hispanic, Latino culture. And it was so revealing. It showed exactly what they needed to do to start moving towards finding ways to recruit and engage the new community around them. I just thought it was a priceless endeavor on their part, and they've done really well since all of that. But I guess my question for Dave is, because I know you've talked about this before, and I think it's an awesome answer about how you keep this assessment from becoming just another stereotype, or where you start putting people in boxes and stereotyping people.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one of the values of when you do the cultural values profile together with a team of people, because you pretty quickly see, and I haven't looked recently at Harry's cultural values profile, so I'm going to just use you as a fictitious example here, but I would guess you would see that Harry doesn't align all across all 10 with where Asians typically fall. There might be some in which he does. And same for me, I don't fall on all 10 where Anglos do. So one of the ways that we immediately challenge the stereotypes is, okay, beware that just about the time that we've said, there tends to be a pattern among many Asian Americans that are more collectivist. Someone in your own group may actually be more individualist than one of the Anglos is. So that would be a key piece that's there. I see too that somebody's asked the question, how do these 10 dimensions align with Hofstede's work and Aaron Meyer's? Excellent question. So the late Geert Hofstede, who just passed away a couple months ago, he and I have been collaborating on this work for a number of years, as well as Franz Trompenaar's The Globe Leadership Study. Aaron Meyer's work is a more practitioner focus that stemmed from a lot of this work. So we have absolutely been informed by Hofstede's work. 5 of the 10 values that we mentioned measure very closely to theirs. As Harry mentioned, these are unique areas that we've looked at specifically. The other big difference to our 10 dimensions compared to these other ones that are out there is where they apply equally to domestic diversity as they do to international. So that'd be another way that we get at what Harry just asked about in terms of stereotyping, is we try and downplay here's the way the Germans are, here's the way the millennials are, instead say, hey, you can't put people in boxes. And so we use these to say, what's your own personal orientation on each of these that may be informed by any number of things. Your ethnic heritage could be part of it, but the fact that you're in ministry is part of it. I see very different norms when I'm working with senior leaders in ministry as compared to when I, jump over and go into Google and talk with them, with their executives. So, there's many factors that play into where one gets their cultural values, nationality and ethnicity being only one of them.
Well, I want to come right back to that as we announce our partnership day, because that's a great segue, talking about the difference of accessing and using and leveraging CQ assessment and training cultural values, profiling with secular companies as you do. It's a very positive thing. In my own, for what it's worth, when I took it, I thought it's like, like Apple, it's just user friendly. I scored for, after 20 something years of working in this area, if you will, I scored relatively okay in drive and strategy and action towards the top tier, but my knowledge was real low or much lower than I would like it to be. And that was so good because, again, it's like you're saying, okay, here's some areas I'm doing relatively well in, but then it identified an area in terms of knowledge that I was weaker in. And both for me as an individual and or if an organization was like that, in terms of coaching on the back end, then you can say, let's hone in on improving your knowledge as an organization or individuals, or let's hone in on your lower score in strategy. And this is what is so user-friendly. I think this is what Chip is getting at, where some other instruments might be cumbersome, a little lengthy, don't necessarily give you any positive feedback or point you to the future, where CQ assessment, CQ Pro in terms of the cultural values profile, it does all that and more. I'm so happy to have this partnership with you, Dave. And back to what we were saying to segue, you are working. Tell us about some of the secular companies, or just name them if you would, but then transition to talk about what you went looking for about a year ago, which was a partner like Mosaics who could deliver this on your behalf and behalf of the CQ Center to faith-based organizations. Talk to us about the secular side, and then what led you to move towards a partnership with an organization like Mosaics?
Yeah, so it kind of has come full circle, because as I mentioned at the beginning of our time, my roots are in ministry, and likewise that was where I first was applying cultural intelligence. My first book, Serving with Eyes Wide Open, used CQ as a way to correct some of the ills of short-term mission projects that don't respect culture. And then suddenly I found myself writing a book that was more broadly applying this to the business arena. And so it's been an incredible journey. We have the chance to work with some fairly impressive sounding organizations, the BMWs, Googles, Coca-Colas, Facebooks of the world, do a lot with Harvard Business School, London School of Economics. But then, in the next conversation, we're talking with US Department of Defense and looking at how to ensure that the cultural readiness programs are actually developing culturally intelligent special operations people. And then, you jump into the next one, it's with a community college who's trying to think about how they develop a more inclusive environment on campus. and then little organizations like ourselves, but working in a different space, who are saying, hey, we might be only an organization of 30 to 40 people, but we want to function in a culturally intelligent way. So that's been a rich journey for me, and conversation for another time. But my mother, who unfortunately just passed away a year ago, she said to me one day a couple years ago, I'm not sure what to say to my friends anymore when they ask whether you're still in ministry. And I'm like, oh, Mom, you can tell them I'm still in ministry. I'm engaged in more kingdom-rich conversations today than I was in many of my years in full-time ministry. But her point was well taken, because the vast majority of my calendar now is filled with conversations with people who are thinking about how CQ links to their bottom line or links to their defense initiatives. And there was this nagging sense to me of, we're no longer is richly serving the cause that matters most to me. And so as we continue to grow, and frankly, to be really transparent with you all, even for us as an organization where we have people from a variety of backgrounds, we were asking, how do we effectively serve churches who are saying, okay, I came through that CQ program you did, but it was very kind of corporate oriented or academic education oriented. And so we said, you know what, we need to find a partner in this space where we can unapologetically work with them on giving laser focused of how CQ links to the kinds of things that Mark was saying a few minutes ago about the New Testament imperatives and that. And so we put out a request for proposals. Talk to us about ways that you're already engaged in this work. And we asked some of the core things that are important to us of, talk to us about the diversity on your own staff. Talk to us about the experience you have with this. And we were inundated with a lot of very, honorable proposals of groups that were interested in really partnering with us. But it was a no-brainer for me as soon as Mark and I started to ask, and I had to kind of remove myself from the process so I didn't favor it with our leadership at large, but became pretty quickly apparent to us, both because of the heart of Mosaics and the experience and credibility of what they were doing, that they were our strategic partner of choice in really taking CQ much further and deeper and wider across the ministry realm. So yeah, the 1st of January, we officially formulated a strategic partnership with Mosaics where they would really become the face of CQ in the ministry arena. And we were super enthused about that for 2 months. And then I think literally the last public event that I was at before COVID-19 included my brothers, Harry and Mark, and then the whole world kind of changed, quite literally. And so yes, that's what brings us to today of like, okay, but we're still engaging in this partnership. So yeah, that was a long answer to your question, but I'm so excited about what we get to do with you all that it's hard for me to make it a bullet point talking point.
Well, no, it wasn't long at all. And I'm so appreciative. I'm sure everybody watching is appreciative of that and your journey, and ultimately revealing, if you will, your heart for Christ, for the church, for the mission of God on earth, even as we represent and advance the common good and all the other ways you're doing through secular organizations and even the military. But this is advancing the common good. And we believe the Holy Spirit uses that there's not necessarily a sacred secular divide, that when we represent Christ well as ministers of reconciliation, ambassadors of Christ, that God uses that in ways we may not be able to measure. Somebody gets saved or they begin attending my church, but the winsomeness by which we interact with those who do not yet know him as we do, we believe that puts points on the board in the heavenly realm, and God is big enough to understand that and to use it even if we can't see it. So there you have it. I don't know if you missed that in Dave's answer, but there's the announcement. Mosaic Global Network, along with the Cultural Intelligence Center, is excited and pleased to announce for the first time today that we are now the strategic partner of CQ, that is Mosaics with the CQ Center, providing on their behalf cross-cultural intelligence assessment, CQ assessment, the cultural values profile, CQ Pro, both in terms of assessment, group workshops, reports, training, and even on the back end coaching to advance this on their behalf. We signed, as Dave said, a license agreement in January 1 to represent that. We're not taking over that as if we're a separate company or a separate entity, but rather I see we're working alongside and in partnership. It's almost as if CQ, the center, correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, but it's as if the Cultural Intelligence Center has opened a new division and assigned Mosaics to be the head of that division. And this division, as Dave mentioned, is to advance and to provide CQ assessment and training for churches, Christian organizations, faith-based organizations around this country and around the world. And as Dave said, Harry and I were with him mid-March out in Los Angeles when the whole COVID thing crisis hit. But what's amazing to me is without even advertising yet, I think, Harry, we've sent out already 15 contracts or something. The demand for cultural intelligence in the Christian world, in the Christian community, we've just been shocked, knocked off our feet without even advertising. It's not even on our website, but just word of mouth and maybe a little pent up demand or need. A desperation, of course, moves us to cry out at times, but we are just blown away by how many churches, Christian schools, organizations, we're now having conversations with, sending out proposals for. And I know if you're listening, you've listened this long, as Dave mentioned earlier, you have a drive, an internal drive, and or a need as a leader of a multi-ethnic or organization or church, or that you want it to be, to understand your own cultural intelligence, have that for your team, have that for your church. And now, again, announcing today, on behalf of the CQ Center, Mosaics will lead the charge for them in this arena. And we're talking about that, announcing that today, even in this moment. So Dave, real quick, pretend you were leading that division and think about it from somebody who's still listening. What is it that we do? We provide assessment and then workshops, group reports from your perspective, and then I'll follow that up as we move to close and how people can actually get involved and take advantage of a discount that we're going to announce and offer today.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you said it well. I think the assessment by itself, I'll be the first to say, has very little value unless you have a highly motivated individual who's going to do their homework on how to make sense of it. But the assessment kind of creates a burning platform. So imagine you've got a group of leaders, hey, everybody take this. So we're going to get a diagnostic on where we are. Then what the workshop allows us to do is now let's have some really live interactive discussion about where are we as compared to where do we want to be, and how does that connect with what we're trying to do organizationally as a church, as a ministry, as a denomination. And then one of the things I love about what you have designed at Mosaics is then what's kind of the post-workshop follow-up. One of the things that's really critical to us at the Cultural Intelligence Center, it was why partnering with a group like Mosaics was critical, is we don't view this as a one-off kind of thing. It can't be check the box. It can't be, okay, this year for our leadership retreat, we're going to do something on diversity. Oh, next year we're going to do, it has to be an ongoing process. And so that's really what Mosaics offers. Yes, there can be an isolated engagement of take the assessment, do a workshop and do that. But then how does that factor into the broader things that Mosaic has been doing for years, long before you engaged in partnership with us, of how do we really help develop an ongoing strategy for effective multicultural ministry?
Yeah, so from our perspective at Mosaics, we've had over 20 years of experience in this. And if we land at your church or work with you, or of course, we, by personal experience, by our professional experience, we could do a pretty good job of saying, here's where you're at, here's where I think you need to go. And of course, as Dave mentioned, we've been able, by the power of God and the Holy Spirit, to be somewhat effective in moving that ball for many churches and denominations across the board, the spectrum. But what we didn't have was this robust research tool to be very precise and say, here is actually where you're at as measured against 150,000 people in 165 countries. We didn't have that research-based tool. And as Dave is mentioning, they had the research-based tool and all the knowledge and the academics, everything that is behind that, that's gone into it for more than 10 years. But then again, after the fact, that practical pastoral experience, that's no longer what Dave is doing with most of his time. And so we both look at it like Reese's peanut butter cup. We bumped into each other. They got the chocolate, we got the peanut butter, and boy, it tastes so much better together. And that's what we want to tell you. If you're a pastor or ministry leader listening, how does this work? You're going to email Allison@mosaics.info, ALISON@mosaics.info, or you can go to mosaics.info, our website. Right on the front page, right there, you can just say, hey, I'd like to talk to Mark DeMoss for 30 minutes. Type in your email. One way or another, you're going to get in touch with us and say, I am interested in CQ assessment and the cultural values profile for myself, for my staff team, or for your church. We'll help you identify the group that you're going to work with in terms of providing this assessment to. We'll take it from there, but you're going to contact us and we're going to follow up. What will happen then is once we agree to go forward, then we're going to provide CQ assessments for your team. We literally have contracts now with teams of 14 all the way to 180 people. So no matter the size of your organization team, who you want to do this with, we will give you access to the assessment. People will take the assessment. On the back end, Harry, Lee, and our team will process a group report, fully faith-based, by the way. As Dave mentioned earlier, there is a lot of secular understanding. Again, we don't necessarily see a secular sacred divide at Mosaic, but the workshops and the way they approach companies is very different in some ways than we would approach that and with faith-based organizations, and certainly on our side, providing scriptural links and the deep theology that drives all of this. So the point is, you would get access to the assessment for your team. You would take that. On the back end, we prepare a group report and a faith-based workshop that can be delivered in person. Of course, this is pre-COVID, and someday we'll get back to that. It's typically 6 hours, like a 9 to 3 on a Saturday. But now, because of COVID, we are also announcing that that is now online. How you would do that is when we provide that workshop for your team, it would be for 3 weeks in a row for 2 hours. So for instance, you would choose the time and you might say Mondays from 10 to 12 for the next 3 weeks, we're going to do the workshop online with our staff team. And we'll provide that workshop for you in that format. And of course, as things go back somewhere, they won't go back, we all know that. But when we get back to travel and all that, it could also be done in person, which of course is the best, but the times we live in, we have to be agile and adaptive. So all that's to say is you would give the assessment to your team. We would review that. We'd prepare the group report. We'd prepare the training and the workshop. We'd help you understand and aggregate the individual scores so you'd understand where your church is at this moment, like a map of the airport. You are here in terms of your cultural intelligence, as well as the cultural values profile and continuums. And then we would work with you where there may be weak, where you may be weaker, whether it's in drive or strategy or action. We're going to work with you and set up a coaching plan for your team to improve on the areas that you might have shown weaker. I mentioned in my own profile, right? I was weak in knowledge. If that was true for our entire organization, we will help craft a coaching strategy and a plan to improve your knowledge. And perhaps even 1 year later, you might want to take the assessment again, because you can see results literally within 6 months to 12 months of concentrated effort. As Dave has seen with the organizations he worked with concentrated effort, those scores can be improved. Your intelligence as an organization can go up, and you can be much more viable and credible, of course, in today's increasingly diverse, painfully polarized, and cynical society. We're going to wrap this up in just a minute. I'm going to announce that discount as I promised. But Dave, one more question from Jared Sorber. He says this: have you found that as people grow in CQ, they are personally challenged in areas of ethnocentrism, stereotypes, and biases towards other people groups? And a follow-up, do you think there's an application there for churches who are seeking to move people towards becoming reconcilers and bridge builders?
Yeah, absolutely. It's impossible to go through the cultural intelligence journey and not be faced with areas of blind spot, bias, ethnocentrism, etc. And then likewise, we talk about some of the critical links then to how then do you become an advocate for others? What's my role as someone who has a lot of privilege in not just being a bystander, but being an ally, a bridge builder, a champion, whatever language you might use. In fairness, I will say that, you know, CQ is not an end all. So I don't want to overspeak it either. And so there's things that I think have to inform this conversation of multicultural ministry that really get into power differences and the justice issues. And the framework allows for getting at that, but I don't want to overspeak either and say, oh, the assessment is a one-stop shop that gives you everything you possibly need. So yes, there are linkages. It's impossible to be engaged in a real assessment and development plan for cultural intelligence and not be faced with things like ethnocentrism and then now what do I do about this? But I also don't, it's a both and. I also don't want to overstate that just by itself CQ is enough on that. It needs some of the other kinds of things that Mosaics and groups like Bridge Builders and Jared and his work in Baltimore do as well.
Well, Dave, we certainly appreciate the time. First of all, we appreciate you, your heart, your life experience, your journey as a Christ-centered man, a missionary, and now in a sense a business person representing Christ well in the secular marketplace, but your heart as well to make sure that churches and Christian organizations, faith-based organizations, have access to this same training that you and your team are no longer really able to provide in a robust way. And we certainly appreciate the honor that you've bestowed upon us by trusting us, or entrusting, in some sense, your baby on the faith-based side to us to represent you well. Again, if you're just tuning in, we are not taking over CQ, the CQ Center Cultural Intelligence Training. We are being grafted into the CQ Center to provide faith, cultural intelligence, CQ assessment, cultural values profile, and much more to faith-based Christian organizations, churches, nonprofits, schools. And we are super excited to announce that today. Now, here's the deal I promised you: discounted pricing. If you will get in touch with us, and Harry, if you don't mind putting that slide back on the screen, you can get in touch with us with Allison, ALISON, at mosaics.info. Simply email her to say, I'd like to have a follow-up conversation with Mark DeMaz or Harry Lee to discuss my current context, my church, my organization, and how and what it might look like to bring CQ assessment and training to our team and to our staff. Simply email Allison at mosaics.info. Do that. We'll get right back to you. And if we prepare an agreement with you, if you want to go forward and you sign that agreement, and we're going to do this now with you, and you'll do that by June 30th, we're going to take 15% off all pricing. Now, let me just tell you this. If you go to the Cultural Intelligence Center and you were to try to engage Dave or his team directly, it's at least 3 or 4 times more in terms of cost, perhaps, because they're working with an entirely different business model than this. And that was part of what was preventing them from delivering this to churches. I love what you said, Dave. I got to say this, but he said, man, I can't go do this for a potluck, right? And, you know, we all in the church, we're trying to be tight and good stewards with money, but they have a business model. They got like 20 employees. They're scaling another 10. So the business model didn't really work for the church. But as you've heard today, Dave's heart, his passion, his roots are all for Christ, all for the church, all for the mission of God on earth as it is in heaven. And so all that's to say is that we don't have to charge the pricing that is required for Dave and their center to operate, because we are a nonprofit and faith-based, and this is a way we generate sustainable income, not the way. And so for all those reasons, we're able to significantly discount this opportunity to get CQ assessment for faith-based churches, organizations, Christian churches, etc. But having said that, we're even going to take 15% more off that price if you agree to work with us by June 30th. So again, how do you start the process? Allison at mosaics.info, shoot her an email, say, I'd like to talk with Mark and Harry further about these things, ALISON at mosaics.info, and get 15% off already significantly discounted pricing to work with us in the days ahead for your church, for your organization. Dave, again, we're so thankful for who you are, for all you've done to really put this on the map, not just for the Christian world, but really for the world and the companies you're working with. I know you personally, and how you and your company represent the values that are biblical. Even if people working with you aren't Christ-centered people, but they are still principle-centered people. And I love that about the Cultural Intelligence Center. And of course, you being behind that, I know that as you interact with the world, you do that in a winsome way. Matthew 5:16, let them see your good works so that they can understand and maybe be drawn to investigate, to encounter the Christ that you know. And so we thank you for walking in both those worlds with such a grace and delicacy, for the intersection and how you don't see it as division, sacred and secular, but you're just a great role model for anybody trying to interact with the world in a winsome way today, represent Christ well. Thank you for what you do and all you've done to bring this to bear. I'll give you the final word, and then we always close in prayer. Harry, I'm going to ask you, of course, if you would pray for Dave and the Cultural Intelligence Center and the launching of our new partnership. But Dave, let me give you a final chance to say goodbye or whatever else you'd like to add before we close today.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. That means a great deal. And I appreciate the same thing about you and Harry and Allison and the rich privilege it is for us to be launching this strategic partnership together. So thanks to you and to all the rest of you who have joined in today, and for just even the encouragement it is to me to know that there's fellow brothers and sisters who are taking time to pause and consider, how do we do this better, especially in a time of so much divisiveness across our country and world. So thank you and blessings to all of you.
Awesome. Well, let's pray for Dave for this launch and this program going forward. Lord, we do give you so much thanks. I'm so grateful for Dave Livermore and the CQ Center, and we pray great, great blessings on this partnership for your kingdom's sake, that many would come to know you as a result of this, and just expanding our worldview to be one that is just so incredibly kingdom-minded. Stretch the way we think, break us out of our own cultural bubbles, show us the heart and mind of Christ, especially for those who are disconnected, disenfranchised, who we may think are even outside of the realm of the gospel somehow, not necessarily in thought, but maybe by action. And so we pray that this would just be a tremendous journey in everybody's faith, especially those that respond, that know they need to do something but don't quite know what they need to do. This is just, Lord, we pray you would use it, that it would be a great first step for so many. Bless it, protect us all, give us wisdom, go before us in all things, and we pray it in Christ's name. Amen.